Great. So welcome everybody, for those of you who are already on the call, to today's webinar. This is hosted by the Carbon Pricing Contest at MIT's Climate CoLab. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Climate CoLab, we run a series of contests where people from around the world can submit their creative solutions to climate change. And we're currently running a contest on the politics of carbon pricing in the United States, which asks the following question: how could a national price on carbon be implemented in the US? This contest closes in 9 days, and we invite you, as people calling in on this call who are no doubt interested in the topic, to submit your creative ideas before this deadline and to comment on existing proposals. So today's webinar is a discussion with 3 very prominent politicians about the politics of pricing carbon in the United States, and we're very thrilled to have them with us today, and we're also excited for all of you to be joining us. Since you no doubt know who each of these people are, I'll just give you a very brief introduction, which is that first we have George Shultz, who is a former U.S. Secretary of State, and he's currently the Thomas W. and Susan B. Ford Distinguished Fellow at the Hoover Institution. We also have Bob Inglis, who is a former U.S. Representative from South Carolina and the current Director of the Energy and Enterprise Initiative. And finally, we have Phil Sharp, who is a former U.S. Representative and the current President of Resources for the Future. And my name is Leah Stokes, and I'm a PhD candidate at MIT, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. So the way that today's webinar is going to work is I'm going to start out with a series of pre-prepared questions on the topics that we circulated in advance. And for the last 15 minutes, we're going to turn to questions from the audience. So on your GoToWebinar control panel, there should be a place for you to be able to submit questions as we go along. And we'll pick out a few of those at the end and ask them to the panelists. So feel free to put in your questions as we go along. So first, we'll just start out with a quick and relatively easy question for our panelists, which is, how did you first learn about carbon pricing as a solution to climate change? And what got you interested in this topic while you were in office? So I'm going to start out with Phil, and then we're going to hear from Bob and finally George. So Phil, can you talk to us a little bit about how you learned about carbon pricing?
Sure, Lee. Let me I have to do one caveat here. My organization is a research organization, and Resources for the Future does not take public policy positions as an institution. However, individually, we certainly can take them as our scholars do, and I'm president of the organization. So these are my personal opinions, and you're asking about my predating this. Actually, I think I would say my interest became involved way back in 1990 when we established in the Clean Air Act in Congress the SO2 trading system, which was designed to put a price on sulfur dioxide and proved out to be a very successful shift in the way that we regulate in this country. So when the issues of carbon began to come on the public policy table, I certainly gravitated to, I'm not actually committed to only one path on this issue, but gravitating to this, as many economists are, and I'm not an economist, that this is probably from the standpoint of the entire economic system, the most effective and efficient way, depending on whether you get a good solid carbon tax over time.
Great, thanks Phil. So Bob, want to tell us about your history with the topic?
Well, for 6 years, my first 6 years in Congress, I said climate change was hooey, total nonsense, Al Gore's imagination. It was total ignorance on my part. I hadn't looked into it at all. All I knew was he was for it, and therefore I was against it. So that was the first 6 years. I was out 6 years from Congress doing commercial real estate law again, came back for 6 years, starting in '04, and with a much different perspective, having been affected by my kids, by being on the science committee, and really coming to sort of a spiritual epiphany of the importance of dealing with this issue. Those 3 things caused me to be much more interested in climate. It probably wasn't the best time for me to get interested in climate because the Great Recession was on, and having represented the reddest district in the reddest state of the nation, they didn't cotton too much to the idea of pricing carbon. But when I got tossed out of Congress in 2010, I decided to go full bore on this. Once you're identified as a heretic, you may as well just parade right on down the street and proclaim it. So I'm on the street now proclaiming this heresy that is in fact not a heresy, that it's really what conservatives deeply believe. What we deeply believe is there's a market distortion here. And you fix a market distortion, free enterprise will fix this problem faster than government mandates or fickle tax incentives or clumsy regulations. we can do this. We just price carbon. So is the best idea came across in Congress. It certainly was not my idea alone, because many, many people have had it. As Phil just mentioned, this economists have been on this for years. But it's the best idea I came across when I was in Congress. And so post-Congress, I'm committed to trying to see this through to completion and call or enable or encourage conservatives to overcome their inferiority complex. We apparently think we're no good when it comes to energy and climate, but we're very good. We got the answer. With a kid in class needs to raise his hand. We got the answer. And so we just need to overcome the political problems and get there.
Great, thanks, Bob. And we'll get into all those details in a minute. George, do you want to give us a little bit of history for yourself with this issue?
My history goes back to 1969, when I was Secretary of Labor, and the President made me chairman of a cabinet task force on the oil import program. President Eisenhower thought that if we imported more than 20% of the oil we used, we were asking for trouble in national security terms. We were beginning to bump up against that, and that was the reason for the task force. So we made some recommendations, and the President patted me on the head and said, thanks for a nice report. There were hearings. Nobody did anything. Then, a while later, I'm director of the Office of Management and Budget, and the Republican President Nixon signed the legislation that created the EPA. And when a new agency is created in government, there's nobody to speak for them, and they have to get space and people and so on from other agencies. So the OMB will speak for them. So in a sense, I was the first director of the EPA, because the OMB is a good spokesman, but we know where the bodies are buried. Nobody wants to mess with us, so we can set it up. So we set that up. And then I saw the Arab oil boycott. It was more or less what we thought in our task force report. So I've been riveted on the subject of energy and seeing that it has national security implications, that it has economic implications, and it has environmental implications. Then I say now to people who are thinking about this, why don't you do what Ronald Reagan did when he was president? In the mid-1980s, there were a lot of scientists who thought the ozone layer was depleting. There were doubters. Everyone agreed that if it happened, it would be a catastrophe. So Ronald Reagan said, why don't we take out an insurance policy? Insurance is about risk. You hope the risk doesn't materialize, but if it does, you've taken out a policy. So when that got going, the entrepreneurial juices kicked in, and the DuPont company thought up something you could do, not aspire to, but do. And it worked. As it turned out, in retrospect, the scientists who were worried were right. And the Montreal Protocol came along just in time. So I say now, let's take out an insurance. Do what President Ronald Reagan did. And what's the problem? The problem is the climate is warming. Everybody knows that. All you have to do is, never mind the science and all that, just look up north at the Arctic. We have a task force here at Stanford's Hoover Institution on the Arctic Ocean. The new ocean is being created. It wasn't there before. It's warming. There are ice melts all over the place. So the question is why, and why don't we take out an insurance policy? An insurance policy isn't even that expensive. First of all, give sustained support for energy R&D. And I know the Stanford and MIT programs, and these scientists are really getting somewhere and working on things and accomplishing stuff. So that's number one. The second is have a revenue neutral carbon tax. So you're not favoring this and favoring that. You're just saying create a level playing field. Sources of energy that create pollution, it's not good to breathe, let alone the climate, are imposing a cost on society. They should bear that cost in competition with other forms of energy. So a carbon tax is the way to do it. And as Bob said, a carbon tax is an efficient way to do it because it lets the market sort out. Putting everybody on a level playing field lets the market sort things out. So I'm very much in favor of that. And I think of it as doing what President Ronald Reagan did, namely take out an insurance policy about an obvious risk.
Great. Thanks so much, George. That was a great way to start us out, starting to get into some of the details we'll be talking about. So now I want to turn to the 2011 attempts to try to pass a comprehensive cap and trade bill through U.S. Congress under the Waxman Markey bill, as it's commonly referred to. I'd just like to get your views on some of the main obstacles that prevented this bill from ultimately passing, because as we know, it got quite close. Are there things that advocates should have done differently, or what are some of the key lessons we can learn from this? So I'm going to start with you, Bob, and then we'll turn over to Phil and finally George. So go ahead, Bob.
Well, you know, I voted against it, so I guess I'm not the best person to say how it might have been better, except that to say this, I think is hopelessly complicated, embarrassing in the free allocations to the well-connected, decimated American manufacturing, and a massive tax increase. Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? So it's just a problem. It's and I would say to anybody that wants to resurrect or to think they can resuscitate cap and trade, that really it's graveyard dead. It's a resurrection, not a resuscitation. It's a much larger miracle. And so we just need to move on beyond that wreckage and say, especially with conservatives, say, we're not talking to you again about growing the government. We're not talking about a way to grab additional money and bring it in here to government. We're talking about what Secretary Shultz just mentioned, a revenue neutral approach. That has legs. That causes conservatives to be able to entertain the notion. But any sort of attempt to resuscitate cap and trade, I think, is really difficult. It's been successfully branded as cap and tax. And to continue that discussion is just really hard. So better, I think, to switch to a completely revenue neutral, absolute return, 100% returnable emissions tax, and hope that we can show that that really is a free enterprise answer, because it is. I think that there was, beyond that, I can say this, the political environment at the time, if you think about it, a lot of people criticize us conservatives as saying that, gee, it was you all, but think for a minute about what conservatives were facing. We had just elected a guy president who we saw as a community organizer. We are in the greatest recession since the Great Depression. That brand new president, very inexperienced hands on the wheel, was talking about taking over healthcare from our perspective. Now, if he were on the phone with us right now, he'd say, I left it a private system, but we perceived it as he's taking over healthcare. And then there was talk about, at the same time, about regulating what we breathe. I mean, that's how conservatives perceived it. And so it's no wonder that there was some pushback. So, but the Great Recession is letting up. Barack Obama is going to be a lame duck after this next election, after November. And so Obama rejectionism is going to decline. We got an opportunity at that point to push forward on a very different proposal, different than cap and trade, and give conservatives the opportunity to actually lead on this. Their alternative, our alternative as conservatives, is to watch the only other game in town, which is a regulatory approach. Mm-hmm. So it's up to us to come forward with the alternative, and we've got a good alternative if we apply our conservative principles.
Great, and we'll get to that regulatory approach. Phil, do you want to comment on the Waxman Markey attempt?
Sure. I don't fully agree with Bob, though I think he makes some very good points. One, I would just go back and remind us about one of the good fundamentals about it, which has been lost in the shuffle, and I certainly don't think it's something to be resurrected anytime soon, and that is that a cap and trade system, when it's clean and simple, is a device, which one can still argue may be too complicated, to get a market price on carbon. And our scholars have written extensively about comparing these two devices and where they're similar, where they're not. And so much depends on how they're designed as to what effect you get. So without going back through that kind of analysis, I think it is important to say that in one way, we were on the right track with the idea that pricing carbon was the wisest thing to do. Now, I also believe that one of the design and political problems in the way it was created in the House of Representatives and had previously been created in some Senate proposals was they recognized that these credits had value, and so they become like appropriations. And this is where Bob is focusing on, and conservatives rightfully blew the whistle on the fact that it just became almost an appropriation bills for anything that looked, smelled, sounded like it had anything to do with climate, and you could get it in and give it an allocation. And I think that was a mistake for messaging. It was a mistake for a good policy kind of proposition. And this brings me back to when we get to the carbon tax, which we will, apart from the design of that tax, the other huge question is what do you do with the revenue, and you should not just willy-nilly give it away kind of proposition. But I would also add that there also were, obviously the political climate was very difficult by the time they got to this after health care. The administration's position and strength had dissipated, the Congress was divided, and to be frank about it, I don't think we had very effective Senate leadership on this particular issue, which were experienced with the issues previously and who actually could understand it. I don't think that's the big cause of why it failed, but I think that some of what was wrong, or many of us would criticize in the design in the House bill, could have been corrected through an effective negotiation if there had been people to negotiate, both from the conservative side as well as from the liberal side of the Senate. And I frankly think that was missing, despite some individuals who gave a lot of effort to it.
Great, thanks, Phil. George, any comments about the Waxman Markey bill and what happened there?
Well, first of all, leaving aside the cap and trade, how many pages was that bill, Bob? A couple thousand pages?
Yeah, I think it's
Nobody knew what was in
1,300,
it.
yeah.
You have these grab bags that are just full of stuff. All kinds of pork gets put in it. It was a terrible way. If you're going to pass something, keep it simple and short where you can understand it. A simple carbon tax is easy to understand. You don't have to embellish it with 2,000 pages of stuff. You could probably put it out there in about 10 pages, and then everybody would understand it. So I think the Waxman Markey bill was just stuff full of nonsense. A cap and trade system is better than nothing, but not much. The trouble is the price fluctuates all the time, and nobody knows quite what it is, and they give out credits for growing trees that you're going to grow anyway, or whatever. And so it's subject to all sorts of corrupt and fraudulent things, whereas a tax, there it is, straight, plain, straightforward tax. So I think it's a much better way to go about it. You know what the price is going to be. It's set, doesn't fluctuate. I think actually the way it should be introduced is to start small and by a legislative process have it escalate so it comes in gradually. I might say that British Columbia has a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Mm-hmm. They've had it for about 5 years. And it's interesting to see that the real growth of the economy of BC has gone up slightly faster than Canada as a whole. In other words, the tax has not killed off economic growth at all. And they have a healthy system there.
Great. Thanks, George, for bringing in a concrete example there, too. So now we're going to turn to the regulatory approach, which Bob sort of alluded to in his last comments. So I'd just like to get your views on what you think about the current regulatory approach through the EPA to reduce carbon pollution using the Clean Air Act. Does this approach replace a need to do something through Congress about getting a price on carbon? And do you think that this approach will be effective? So George, do you have any comments about the current regulatory approach? And then we'll turn to Phil and Bob.
Well, I don't like it when the president starts out by saying, here's my program, and you stupid people in Congress don't have the sense to do anything about it, and I'm just going to use my pen and my phone, and I'm going to do it myself. That's not the way to get something accomplished. The way to get something accomplished is to go to the Congress and say, look, we got a problem, right? Let's discuss the problem. Let's all agree, and I think it's pretty obvious we have a problem. Now, what can we do about it? Let's talk about that. and let's start having discussions of what possibilities are, and work with the members and go down there. Ronald Reagan used the White House theater tremendously. Just bring people down, husbands and wives, and nothing heavy, just have a good time, get to know each other, work these things. And that's the way you have to do. You can't ignore Congress and cuss Congress out all the time. You got to work with Congress. And when you do, you find that they're responsive. So I think this business of go it alone is not the way to go. And it turns out almost always, and I've had a lot of experience in this, and economic issues and national security issues, that if you listen to members of Congress, you learn something. They know things. And you construct something that's better. So I think that the way you go about things it should be much more consultative than the current administration seems to do. The EPA approach is their approach is very sort of dictatorial. And so is a question whether they're exceeding their authority or not, and so on. And the Supreme Court has ruled somewhat in their favor here recently, but there are all sorts of questions about it. It'd be much better if you were able to form some sort of consensus behind what we should do. And the only way to forge a consensus is to really work at it and really consult and really listen and try to take views into account.
Great, thanks, George. So, Phil, I hear that as a former representative, you might have some good ideas. So, would you like to share them with us about the EPA approach?
First of all, of course, I do appreciate what the Secretary is saying. That is a very effective approach. And I would be partially critical of the administration for the way they're handled Congress over the recent years. But I don't think there's any question that Ronald Reagan did not face the same kind of highly organized, highly financed opposition. Not that he didn't face opposition, but and the Democratic Party was different at that time because it.
Well, Ronald Reagan was asked if Tip O'Neill was his adversary. He said not after 6 o'clock.
Absolutely.
And then they could get together. The two Irishmen cut deals on all kinds of subjects, and he could also call up, hey Tip, it's at 3 o'clock, but reset your watch. We got to work this problem.
No. I like that philosophy. I think it's good. Had the administration started out that way, it might have worked better. But we are where we are. And we have a highly financed, highly organized opposition to even denial. It's diminishing in the country about the issue. If you can get people to agree there's a problem, and the president might have managed it better. But I think we are at a point where this isn't just an administrative program. In fact, I almost wish they wouldn't claim that. This is a serious effort to regulate in the absence of Congress getting its act together with or without presidential leadership. And presidency is always essential in Congress working well. But I frankly think there are a lot of other people that have serious responsibility in this country for failure to act, and for us not to have taken a simpler approach because they were unwilling to come to the table with anybody. Some of the factions in Congress, some of the outsiders. But that apart, where are we and what did this has for? What is interesting about this is they probably have the fundamental authority to regulate on this by virtue of the Supreme Court. But how they regulate will be disputed and attacked. What is interesting about the EPA compared to the way they normally operate is that they actually have gone out and done considerably more consulting than they ever do and ever have historically done on anything. Second of all, they have actually set it up in which there are lots of alternatives for states. Now, we can argue.
I like that feature.
And they really have. And so there is a real possibility here for the electric industry and other participants to make more decisions than customarily they would get to make. In other words, usually the EPA boxes them into one or two choices. We have a long way to go on this, and we at RFF will be having multiple kinds of sessions and discussions over discrete issues on this, so I'm not ready to pronounce in a broad way about this. But I think, but one thing I do think is important is, given the way and the difficulty of politics, I think one of the useful things that will happen is to generate more debate in states about this, since they will have decision-making power, and it may lead to people beginning to wake up and say, well, maybe there's a more effective way, and maybe it should be a carbon tax.
Great, thanks, Phil. So what about you, Bob? What do you think about this regulatory approach? Do you think it's going to be effective? What's your take?
Well, I hope that what Phil just said is true, that it becomes clear that we need an alternative to this. That really could be something productive that comes out of the president's regulatory move. I think regulating CO2 through the Clean Air Act is precisely the worst way that we could attempt to address climate change. First of all, the act wasn't intended for that purpose. Second of all, it's going to be very cumbersome. Now, I do agree that the state flexibility is positive, but even that's going to be challenged in court. So what we have is this Lawyers' Full Employment Act that the president has passed with this, or the EPA has created for lawyers, because litigation is going to go on for quite a while. But you know, I want to associate myself with the Secretary said that really there's a better way to do this politically, and that is if the president in his State of the Union address, rather than saying it is a fact, when he said that, he was doing midterm electioneering. He was not doing substantive climate work. If he had been interested in doing substantive climate work, this is what he might have said. He might have gestured to his right, which is where Democrats sit in the chamber, and he could have said, we're willing to vote to price carbon dioxide. And then he could have gestured to his left and said, where Republicans sit, I understand that you need for it to be revenue neutral. So here's a deal. We'll supply the votes for pricing carbon, and you get to pick the corresponding tax cuts. And then he could have turned to John Boehner and said, John, deal? Now that would have been breaking things loose, because the risk, of course, for the president is that John Boehner might choose corporate income tax reduction. Well, at that point, it's a real gut check for people that are saying that the sky is falling about climate change, right? I mean, we happen to believe this climate is a real problem, but it's better to address it in a calm voice rather than apocalyptic visions. If you start talking about apocalyptic visions, people don't trust you. They think you're probably selling snake oil or something. So better to speak, as the Secretary did earlier, about an insurance policy, reasonable risk avoidance, and then say, listen, if this is this threat that you think it is, can you take the risk that Republicans might cut corporate income taxes? Or is that such anathema to you that you can't countenance the deal? Well, then it's a gut check for you, right? I mean, so we should put it out there in those sort of bold terms. If we do, you can break through this morass that we've got in Washington, where the sides are polarized and it's just tribal warfare. We gotta do some trans-tribal work here and think outside the box. The box we're in is regulatory answer, created by the Supreme Court's decisions. And in fairness to the president, if he were on with us right now, he'd say, listen, Bob, I'm ordered to do this. I must do it. And he'd be right in saying that, because he's got to comply with the law. And that's good that he's abiding by the rule of law there. The Supreme Court has said that. But I would say to him, sir, there's a way out of this. Get out of this box. Offer something bold and new. And work with Republicans, as the Secretary just said. And maybe we can break this thing loose.
Well, I'd just like to respond a little bit. I certainly like that argument. I certainly like that approach. I think that might have been, but let's not forget there's a major faction in the House that really tried to sell the snake oil, that when he teams to them and says, we have a problem, they say, no, we don't. Yeah. We don't have a problem. This is not, they are science deniers. I think that's shrinking. I think that's changing. I think that's critical for the country. But in that regard, as we know, the Speaker of the House, like all speakers, have trouble getting their troops together, but has had major troubles on a whole host of issues because of the factionalism at the moment in the Republican Party. By the way, neither party is immune to this, so I'm not trying to make this a partisan issue. But that is an approach that we need to take as a country. The National Academy of Sciences, I was on their America's Climate Choices, came to the same point of view the Secretary and Bob are articulating, that what is critical here is something called iterative risk management. doing what's prudent given what you know, and then re-examining it 4 or 5 years later and doing what's prudent at that time given what you've learned, both in what the problem is and what the answers are. And I do think that's a much better approach than what some of the moralistic ways in which either side engages in. It's either all evil or it's all, you've got to, we're thus to be religious correct on one side or the other, so that we're using our best smarts and prudence as we advance this issue.
Great.
I think you have to recognize that campaigning is an act of division.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm better than you, so vote for me. Governing is exactly the opposite.
The opposite. Right.
Governing is an act of bringing people on board and working with people. And what seems to happen in Washington, everybody's campaigning all the time. So they're always dividing, not governing. And we got to get people in Washington who are interested in governing, which also means management. We can't even conduct a decent spy case anymore. Our guys get caught all the time. What's the matter? There's no management. So that's a problem. But let me say, I think the approach of giving states options is a pretty good idea. And I've been working this issue, and I find states all over the country are working at this. They have different views. They're trying different things. And this is a kind of setup in our country where states can do things to a certain extent the way they want. So it's kind of a laboratory. In California, we have a cap and trade system. And it's interesting that the governor is using about half the revenue generated to fund high-speed rail, which you can't find any money for anyplace else. So you grab the money, and this is one of the problems with free money like that. You want to have it designated for something or given back to people or in some way make it revenue neutral rather than funding government programs. But still, California is trying all kinds of things. Other states, we've had meetings here, people from various states are trying different things. And I think that laboratory approach is good, and maybe we'll see different ways of doing it. We should include BC in this picture because the Canadians are doing things and try to learn what we can from it. And maybe a year or so from now, we'll have learned enough to do something different and better.
Great. Well, I'm glad you're all getting into a debate with one another. I'm sure that everyone listening in is really enjoying this.
I haven't noticed any debate. I'm for both Phil and Bob.
All right. You're campaigning for them for office, eh, George?
I'm going to send the secretary back to Washington because I do think he was one of the most effective people in the multiple positions that he's held.
All right, we're all getting along then. It's a happy family here. But I just want to pause for 1 second, and because a few people have asked, will this be recorded and will it be available online? And yes, it is being recorded and it will be available online. We're going to post the link on the same place where you registered for the webinar, so you don't have to worry about that, although we hope that you'll stay on live. So moving on to the next question here. Do you see that the EPA regulation of carbon pollution could change if, for example, the Republican Party retakes the White House in 2016? Do we think that the current regulatory approach is kind of locked in, or is there potential for it to change if political circumstances change? Do you want to comment on that first, Bob?
Well, I think if we're successful in winning the presidency in 2016, it would make it a tough choice for that new president, wouldn't it? I mean, you either go with what has in the Great Recession been the dominant rhetoric of my party, which is, this is nonsense, we don't need to deal with it, or would you realize the obligation to lead and perhaps propose at that point rather than just oppose? I mean, what we've been doing a lot is just opposing, not proposing. But, you know, I think particularly for the presidency, there is an obligation of leadership, and not so much in the House and the Senate, frankly, because if you're one of the 435 or one of the 100, really you can say and do pretty extreme things. I mean, you could just hold forth on any day about whatever you want to hold forth about, and most of the time it doesn't have any real consequences, you know. I mean, nobody's really hurt by it. But the thing is, there's only one president, And so it's a different deal when the president when if my party is successful in regaining the White House. I think it could be different here. In fact, I mean, I know this is sort of a strange thing to say, but I wonder if we'd be further along on climate action if Mitt Romney had won rather than Barack Obama being reelected. I think that Mitt Romney may have been a Nixon goes to China moment, might have been a Bill Clinton signs welfare reform, might have been Mitt Romney does climate change. Because in a way, just as nobody but Nixon could be trusted to talk with the Chinese communists, nobody but Bill Clinton could be trusted to touch welfare, perhaps it's only a Republican that can touch climate change. Because then people will think, okay, he or she is not overreacting. They're not going with apocalyptic visions. So there's my best case for a vote Republican, and I'm in a 501c3. We don't do electioneering, but that was a joke. You understand? That was a joke. That was
yeah, we got
the IRS is listening. That was really a joke.
You don't have a sign behind you.
Could let me
Go
comment?
for it, George.
One of the problems with policies is the uncertainty created when they go forward on a highly controversial basis. Because everybody says, well, if a different group gets in, they're going to change it. Mm-hmm. If you do things on a more consultative basis, then there's a greater sense of stability. So whatever the EPA does now, it's certain that if a different set of characters comes in, they'll probably change it. And that means if you're being subjected to it, you wait it out and you do one thing or another, but you don't act the way you would if you thought this is a permanent deal. So that's, once again, a statement in favor of doing things on a broader basis as you possibly can. I think the people who say the climate isn't changing are going to be mugged by reality. It's changing, and there's all sorts of evidence out there. And it isn't just the science, and it isn't one-off events like a hot summer or something. With the Arctic Ocean being created, that's a trend line. These huge melts all over the place are trend line. Greenland is becoming green. And so the climate is changing. And the most plausible explanation is the CO2 explanation. So I come back to President Ronald Reagan's approach. Why don't we take out an insurance policy? Because the consequences of it happening are severe.
Great. Thanks, George.
So if the consequences are severe and there's uncertainty, that's what insurance is all about. As I said earlier, the insurance policy is not all that expensive. It's support for energy R&D, and that isn't even controversial. I've had a group of scientists from MIT and Stanford, and we've been working on this. We just published a book on the game-changing things coming out. And I wrote to John Boehner one time. We brought our act to Washington, and he set up a meeting with the House Energy Committee, Republicans on the House Energy Committee, and he stayed for the whole meeting. Selling energy R&D is a piece of cake. Everybody agrees on it. It was in Romney's policy thing. Where people fall off is when the government decides, hey, this is a hot stuff, let's go and invest. And the government goes into business, and everybody falls off the bandwagon, including me. And I keep telling people, look, don't do that. You're going to kill energy R&D in the process. So there's big support for that. And I think if we keep at it and have reasonable examples, in the end, the appeal of a revenue-neutral carbon tax is it gets at the problem in a clear way, and it has a great appeal to anybody who thinks that markets are an important way to solve problems.
Great, thanks, George. Phil, do you want to comment?
Just very quickly. First of all, I certainly want to reinforce what the Secretary and Bob have been saying about the importance of the problem and how I think people are really coming to their senses about it, and the insurance risk analysis approach is the right thing to do. And certainly reinforce that we all ought to be pressing our members of Congress to keep up a solid, basic research budget on this and a variety of questions, but especially on things related to this. And while George is right, or the Secretary is right, that in fact everybody generally agrees with it, when you get down to the hard nuts and bolts of who's fighting over dollars, these dollars get squeezed as well. But let me turn to the question, which is a complicated one in regard to, first of all, the timing that is set up. If they're able to meet their deadline and get the approvals in from states in time, it may be that it's pretty much in place in multiple states in a way that would be unlikely to be undone. The other part of this that I don't think we have a good assessment of yet, and people are arguing about, is just how big a lift is this? Now, there are different states in which the lift is different, and even that is subject to debate. But the question is if it's not as great a lift as some of the critics believe it is, but some of the proponents think it is not that big a lift, then you actually may find that there isn't the political desire to mess with this particular set of rules a lot. So I think some of it's unknown about the politics. There will be this natural argument between, taxation or a regulation kind of thing. But so I think we don't know where they are. I certainly hope with Bob that a Republican and or either Democratic or Republican president will take a sensible, straightforward view on this in the next administration.
Right.
Let me just interject that the carbon that's emitted, it's not only a problem in climate change and all that, it's not good for the air you breathe.
Right.
And everybody says we're a bunch of nutcases out in California. Well, we actually care about the air we breathe. How nutty can you get? Come on, you got to get real about these things.
Great, good point.
Well, that's one of the consequences of this that is not focused on heavily, but as they require ratcheting down of CO2, they will inevitably, in many, depending on the state plan, take out more sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and others that are very serious to your health.
Yeah, and something I might add right there is that gives two reasons for conservatives to particularly be interested in acting. One is, if you allow people to socialize their soot into other people's lungs, how right is that? I mean, so what the Secretary was just saying. I mean, why would it be right for Inglis Industries to be able to socialize its soot? No, Inglis, be responsible, be accountable for your soot. Hold it on your property. Be even biblically accountable for that soot, right? You can't put it in the air and let other people breathe it and show up at the hospital and have the rest of us pay for your Inglis Industries emissions. So that's what we conservatives passionately believe, that I shouldn't get away with that. That if I do that, I got a market distortion that means that I'm benefiting, society is harmed. This is a problem. This goes against our fundamental beliefs. And then the second thing is, what Phil was just saying is true, is the pricing of carbon dioxide will create reduced emissions in other areas, with the result that perhaps some EPA regulations can be repealed. So for conservatives, this should be ringing all kinds of wonderful bells. We can actually shrink the size of government if we do this right. We can make pricing carbon dioxide a way of repealing some Clean Air Act regulations that have become redundant. Then you reduce the size of government. This is a great opportunity for us.
Also,
Bill, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I just want to compliment Bob. I think he's articulated a very important moral principle as well as economic principle about the markets, and that is that you shouldn't get away with socializing and the costs onto everybody else that you are imposing,
yeah.
Kind of thing. And a twist in this issue, we've been talking about when you cut carbon, the other additional health benefits you might get. But if we go the reverse in China, what you notice very quickly is their gross failure to have environmental constraints had led to, if you've been there recently, you know it just gets worse and worse, severe health challenges in the air. When you get off the plane, you will know in Beijing that the air is different. And they're they're working toward trying to solve this problem. In the process of their having to do what we started doing 40 years ago in this country, they will help cut carbon because the co-benefit there works the other way, which is, now they say they're also for trying to cut carbon, but what they've really got to be driven to do for their people are up in arms about it, is cut these other air pollutions. And in the process, in most cases, they will also cut carbon.
Great. So I just want to make sure we have a few minutes here at the end to take a couple questions from the audience. And here's one that builds off of the Inglis Industries comment, which is, do climate reforms need the support of the fossil fuel industry? And what are the prospects for sort of a business consensus along with Congress or the administration on carbon pricing? How can we bring fossil fuel industries into this negotiation process? Phil, do you want to start out?
Well, I'll just start with saying, first of all, some of them are already out there and in. Some have not been very loud voices, and they've been reluctant to be too public about it and get burned in the public debate. But it's not as if they have not. Some of them been. I know a coal company. I know several oil companies that are clearly on this proposition, and a number of coal-burning utilities, all of whom understand the problem. All of them, they may differ over how to address it, but they are not deniers, and they are also not do-nothing people either. But
it's worth taking note of the fact that ExxonMobil has publicly supported a revenue-neutral carbon tax. That's the biggest energy company we have. And I think it's also true that fossil fuel people, if they give strong support to energy R&D, we may figure out how to burn those fuels and minimize the carbon. If there's a heavy tax on it, that calls it to people's attention. And there is progress being made, for instance, on carbon capture and storage and other things like that. And so let the R&D people work and give an incentive to do something about these things, and maybe you get somewhere.
Great. Bob?
Yeah, and unless anybody not believe what the Secretary just said about ExxonMobil, the reason that they may be for it, and I'm for them being for it for this reason, is they can make money on natural gas compared to coal if more plants shift away from coal into natural gas. Well, if all the costs are in on coal and natural gas wins, well, as a free market believer, I'm for them. And I hope they make lots of money selling natural gas and create wealth for all those school teachers, retired school teachers who own their stock. It's a great thing if they create wealth out of selling a lot of natural gas and beating coal. If it's a fair competition and coal loses, well, we're sorry for coal. But natural gas is cleaner. And if all the costs are in and it does better, well, that's free market principles at work. It's happening right now because of the expanded supply of natural gas due to fracking, and the economics are proving the case that we're making here. That if you have a price signal, good things happen. And right now in South Carolina, where I'm sitting, 6 coal-fired plants are being converted to natural gas right now because of the price of natural gas being better than the price of coal. We don't mine any coal here, but so that's an important to tie in your question there about the business and politics. Mm-hmm. Is consider the politics of that too. Some states that have historically been coal states, for example, Ohio. Well, now is it really a coal state? Maybe it's a natural gas state. And what's really remarkable to me is there's some members of Congress who really need to check in with the local Chamber of Commerce because they advocate in Congress as though they were from a coal state. Yo, you are from a gas state. Get different talking points. Change your story. I mean, you're on the wrong side of this thing. I mean, for example, you're from Louisiana, and you're belly aching about a carbon tax. You need to check in with the chamber. The chamber will tell you, no, we got natural gas here. That's what we sell, and we can make a lot of money on this if all the costs are in and all the subsidies are removed. Watch what happens. Free enterprise takes over. We make a lot of money here in Louisiana. So I hope that members of Congress catch up with their chamber here soon and find out whether they're a coal state or natural gas state. More and more states are becoming natural gas states because of fracking and other and directional drilling.
So
I'd
I
just
guess,
like to add
sorry, Phil, go ahead.
two things to that. One is, first of all, almost all the proposals, whether at EPA or in Congress, would not be the death of coal. Now, coal will shrink in that picture. It's shrinking, as Bob says now, because of market forces, among other things, kind of proposition. So it's not an either-or proposition. For years to come, these basic fossil fuels are going to be a part of it. One of the virtues of the carbon tax, if you get it in place over a lengthy period of time with a reasonable expectation of where it is it will help adjust. All these people have a chance to adjust, they and all the rest of us as consumers, to what this changing cycle is, and not just take a bath economically if you happen to be working in the coal industry. Second thing, I think, is more evidence of what both the Secretary and Bob have been talking about, of people moving on this issue, is that we now know that in a number of major corporations in this country, including Exxon, when they do their planning for and their tests for whether to make an investment or not, in their computer models that help them make those judgments, they're not dispositive of the judgment, but they're input into those judgments, they're including the carbon price. They're including an expectation that governments are going to require something on CO2. So the smart leadership in industry is already moving to recognize this in their business practices, and that's the part of the coalition that I think Bob is working hard to try to bring together on this issue, more on the business conservative side of the political fence.
Great. So I just have a quick follow-up on that. So we talked about how perhaps we could see a transition to natural gas, but are we going to also see a transition to alternative energy sources, renewables, and are those as complementary with natural gas as we might think? Because, for example, Ohio, the state that Bob brought up recently, repealed its renewable portfolio standard. So I was just wondering, we're looking to the states to act both through these new potential EPA regulations, but we're also seeing that the states are running up against some problems politically, just like we saw federally, to do some things. So do you think that the states will be as successful to transition the energy system away from carbon-intensive sources? Bob, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, we take not a purist position, but a fairly pure position, which is eliminate all those things. Renewable electricity standards, portfolio standards, that's government putting its thumbs on the scale for one or another. If you simply eliminate all the subsidies, and that means for oil and gas as well. Now, of course, at this point, what's happening is anybody in the wind or solar industry is gasping for air, right? They're thinking, oh my gosh, Inglis has just killed us off. But hold on, there's a second part coming. Attach all costs to all fuels. If you do that and eliminate the biggest subsidy of them all, which is back to Inglis Industries, my ability to belch and burn for free into the trash dump of the sky, that is probably the biggest subsidy of them all. If you eliminate that subsidy, then solar becomes competitive in a lot of places, and wind becomes much more competitive without the production tax credit. That you have to go and have a near-death experience every year in Congress trying to get that thing extended. It's great for lobbyists in Washington, by the way, but it's not so great if you're out there trying to plan a wind farm. And so if we could give this certainty that, listen, the costs are coming to you and the smart money is moving in this, and Phil is so right to point out that, that it's such an important signal that when the smart money is already internally pricing carbon dioxide in their capital decisions, that signal being out there causes people in the political process, it's generally a trailing indicator. The rhetoric in politics trails after where the smart money is already gone. And so we need to make sure the political figures are hearing that the smart money is already moving and anticipating this is going to happen. So I'm not so worried about Ohio repealing renewable electricity standards. That's fine with me. It's okay, because if we just move toward pricing carbon dioxide, eliminating all those subsidies, wow, exciting things are going to happen. It's my faith in free enterprise, I suppose.
That's fair. George, what do you think? Do you agree with Bob's take on that?
Yes, I do, but I have a ringside seat in watching the scientists and engineers at MIT and at Stanford work on alternative energies. Solar panels are competitive now, and over half the cost is installation cost. So I say to the solar guys, hey, why don't you figure out how to make something that's easier to install? And they'll knock the socks off the cost. And there are people here on campus who are making real big strides on battery technology. There's going to be a lithium-ion battery that's far better than what's available now. It can take your car over 200 miles, 300 miles. All the range anxiety goes out of it. I have solar panels on my house here on the Stanford campus. Long since paid for them by what I've saved on my electricity bill. I drive an electric car around town. How much does my fuel cost me? Nothing. Nothing. What's not to like? These things are competitive.
All right.
You
George,
guys
I
are worrying about
appreciate the optimism.
price of gas at the pump.
All right,
Sun
Phil, what
shines
about
and you
you?
get electricity.
What is your take on this?
I certainly like what both of them have had to say, and Bob's logic about if we'd gotten on this path of a carbon price a decade ago and set this up, I would be inclined to go with him. But I won't comment on what we should do or not do in this particular case, as opposed to say that what I think is going to happen. First of all, we need to recognize that Ohio did not repeal its RPS. What it did was put a weight in it for the next 2 years, the ratcheting up that is in place. And in there's been efforts in about 10 states to actually repeal the RPSs, and no places have been successful after a major political turnover in their legislatures in 2012. I think there were 5 cases where this was really likely to have happened. So I think the likelihood that people are going to suddenly repeal this, the issue becomes the hard issue, and it shows up in this rule, is what is the interplay between natural gas and the carbon rule and renewables. And in fact, one of the issues that EPA is going to seek comment on, I heard the administrator speak on this as well, it's certainly something our folks are looking at here, is the way in which they calculate what the state requirement is, given these two things, and what is the interplay? Because, of course, natural gas is the flexible fuel, can be. You have to learn to change some of your generation to be more flexible and ramping up fast to take care of the intermittency of wind and solar. Everybody's on top of this in general, that there's some working out here, but it's not a simple proposition. By the way, the marketplace, I have great faith, will work this out as to what is the relationship of this. But my suspicion is, if we're looking at how we're going to approach this here, is it's going to end up being a mix of tax and regulatory, and what we try to do is be as smart about that as we can.
Great. Well, I think we're just in the last minute here, so I just want to take a second to thank all of you for what I think was an extremely dynamic and insightful conversation. I'm glad that we have it recorded and we'll be posting it, because I think a lot of people will benefit from the candid insights that all three of you shared. It was quite a refreshing conversation compared to others, which, you know, can be quite a stale topic in some ways. How will we get a price on carbon year 15, year 30? It seems like a never-ending story. So I think you brought a lot of fresh insight into this, and I really appreciate you taking the time. And finally, I just want to plug again that our contest is wrapping up in 9 days, and these will in part be your judges. So if you heard what they said and you think alike, you are like minds, then you should really consider submitting an idea or commenting and adding to an existing idea, because we need everybody's sharp ideas in this debate, and hopefully we can get a price on carbon in the United States in the near future. So thank you all for sharing your optimism and your criticism.